Welcome to the Ad Astra podcast. Today we have with us Professor Kocku von Stuckrad. Welcome. Professor Stuckrad is a professor of religious studies at the University of Groningen, and he's also the co-founder and co-director of the research center Counterpoint. He has been, he hadn't dedicated himself to his history of astrology, but he has wrote a number of papers and books on the subject. And of them, I would highlight Horoscopes and the Public Spheres, which he edited with other authors and was the result of a big conference in 2004 in Amsterdam, which gathered a lot of historians of astrology at that point. Perhaps one of the largest so far, I think. And also he has a history of astrology, which has been quite useful for those studying the topic, which unfortunately is in several languages: Italian, Portuguese, German, of course, the original title, but not in English, surprisingly.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah. So welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Especially for me, because you were my supervisor, one of the supervisors in my MA, and we haven't seen you for, I think, 9 years. Mm-hmm. So it is a pleasure to see you again. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. And so let's begin.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your studies into the history of astrology?
Yes, yeah. Thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. And astrology has been a topic that I've been working on since my studies, actually, at the University of Bonn and Cologne in Germany, where in my master's research, which is already 20 years ago, or longer, it's 25 years ago, addressed astrology in the ancient context. So I did my master's thesis on Jewish and Christian, or Jewish astrology in the Bible, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, and in the Qumran context, in the Qumran scrolls, or the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's also what I then extended into my PhD project about, again, ancient astrology in a Jewish and Christian context, which then also included the Manichaean, the Gnostic stuff, or the kind of interreligious conversation, if you want, that was going on in the ancient world about astrology and about the topics that are related to that, like fatalism, like all these ethical questions that come along with astrology. And since then, I've been working myself, if you want, through the centuries into the Middle Ages and early modern period, and particularly the 19th and 20th centuries, which is my main scholarly habitat over the last couple of years. And also my more recent work is more addressing the contemporary or the modern developments of these ancient lines. But I always find it interesting to see the connection between our imagination of the past and the way we deal with these issues in the contemporary world. So our relation to the past is a very creative one, if you want, and also modern or contemporary. I wouldn't even call it modern, but the contemporary contexts are also dictating or influencing how we describe the past and what we actually see in the past and what we don't see in the past. So there is although I would call myself a historian of science and philosophy and religion, I would also describe this as a kind of discursive history that you see that is particularly relevant also when it comes to these sometimes called occult sciences like astrology, alchemy, magic, and Kabbalah or whatever. So these systems of knowledge that are somehow at odds with a lot of things that we take for granted today when it comes to science and philosophy and religion. And what I'm interested in is looking into the ways that certain discourses, certain societies come up with differentiations between what is accepted knowledge and what is non-accepted knowledge, or what is fringe, what is center, what is the hegemonic approach to knowledge, and how this changes over the years. And that is also what I find particularly interesting when it comes to astrology, because it's one of the major examples where you can study the hybridity of what we know or what we think we know about the world, and how the world or the cosmos is related to ourselves, to our history, to science, to what we know about nature, and all these questions. And what you see is that disciplines like astrology, alchemy, or magic have been singled out as the nemesis of modernity, if you want, in the 19th and 20th century. So we came up with this very binary assumption that there is astronomy versus astrology, that there is science versus magic, and there is chemistry versus alchemy, and these don't fit together anymore. And it's so interesting to see that way in until the early modern period, they were easily fitting together as one kind of universal understanding of the world, even though these people already knew, these scholars already knew that there are two different approaches, more a measuring or calculating approach to the stars, and more a hermeneutic approach to the stars. But they were still looking at this as two sides of one activity or one system of knowledge that are both needed to come to an integrative understanding of the world. Mm-hmm. So that's a very long introduction to the topics that fascinate me when it comes to astrology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think we couldn't agree more.
Yes. And,
we couldn't agree more.
And that's exactly, for example, what I've been observing in the 17th century, where my current research is focused. You can see exactly that combination, because in the classes of astrology that I'm studying, astrology is presented as the practical application of astronomical calculation. So you have this very complex, very well explained and developed introduction to calculus, theory of motion of the planets, with all the mathematics, and then all of that has as an endpoint, in most of the cases, the interpretation facet, which then comes to be astrology. And they are presenting it as a seamless connection between the two, although they know there is a distinction. But still, it's the same knowledge that is going around and having different facets of the same thing, and that's quite on the spot with what you were saying. And this is already late. Some of these are late 17th century, and I still have an example of this in a very early 18th century. So we can see the line going through where that distinction doesn't apply to our current thought. Yeah.
So maybe the question is, how did this happen? This polarization that you mentioned, this different way of looking at these things. How and why did we change our way of looking at these topics? Mm-hmm. Why does it change, and when? I don't know if we already have an answer, but perhaps we have some ideas that we can share.
Yeah. So I think the major transformation of this discourse happened in the 19th and particularly in the 20th century. Not even in the 19th century. If you look into romantic science, and which is still described as Naturphilosophie, or philosophy of nature, and the first use of the English word scientist is not older than the 1860s. So before that, there is no English use of the term scientists. These were philosophers or scholars, or there were other words for that, and that already indicates a little bit how what we see happening in the 19th and 20th century was a kind of polemical disjunction that was going on. But even in that context, not a successful one. If you look at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, for instance, where occultism was a heyday of occultism, this period, and there was so much going on also in astrology. For instance, if you only look at Berlin, where I'm living, if around 1900 there were hundreds of registered astrologers you can call or you can go to, and they were giving their readings in the street with posters of zodiacs and everything. I mean, and charts, and it was. And Corinna tried to call that the mass movement in Germany around 1900, and that is true for astrology, but also for other alternative kind of new spiritualities, all kinds of new developments that was going on there. So even until the 1920s and 1930s, there was still, it was not so clear which way these sciences would actually go. So we are looking at a quite short period of history where we see this distinction happening. And I'm not saying that there wasn't critique of astrology before that. I mean, we know that Pico della Mirandola was famous. I mean, that goes back into antiquity, but it was still kind of critique of a certain understanding of astrology rather than that the whole knowledge system is worthless. Mm-hmm. It's certain aspects of it, like the deterministic interpretation of it versus free will. That is a big thing for religious context or philosophical context, or there's other things that are going on, but this polemics that astronomy and astrology doesn't talk to each other anymore is something that is quite recent. And just maybe to give an example of how this distorts our understanding of history, if you look back into cultural history, and that you can go back till the Babylonians, basically, so 5,000 years ago. And you see that makes astrology so fascinating, I think. You see certain practices and theories about the stars that are very hard to classify in a binary model, which we are so used to. Because if you look at that from a different angle, it can be science, it can be philosophy, it can be metaphysics, it can be religion or spirituality, can be psychology, it can be agriculture, politics, historiography, and astrology is basically everything of that at the same time. And if you look at famous examples, for instance, like the Astronomical diaries in Babylonia, which is maybe some historians call that the longest lasting research program in history, because it was a program that went for more than 700 years. And what did they do? They and these were priests, so you have religion there. Yeah. So, but these were priestly scholars. These were philosophers, magoi, or whatever you want to call them. Mm-hmm. And there are different names for these people. But what they did was just empirical research. They just observed in a very, I mean, you can't understand this in a more modern way than what they do. They just wrote down everything they observed without interpretation, and everything was just put together on clay tables, and then written down and archived. Everything, like a fox came into town, or there was this disease in that province, or there was a shortage of this grain or something, everything. And at the same time they recorded everything, that Venus was reddish, this, or was rising reddishly, or whatever. So all these kinds of, and of course also the exact observations of the paths of the stars. And then they wrote this down for like 700 years. And then when something happened again, like again a Venus was reddish or so, what the priests had to dive into the archives and look up what happened last time. Oh, there was a shortage of that grain, or there was an upheaval in that province, or some, and then they had to report to the king, maybe you should be careful with that region there, with that province, because there might be another troublemaker there or something. And that was an empirical test, actually. And if they didn't find, or if the king wasn't happy with it or whatever, so they then adjusted their observation. So that was at the same time a very empirical method, but also it shows the hermeneutical aspect of it, because then these priests had to, these priest scholars had to write their reports to the kings, and we have all these letters of the scholars to the kings, and they say, oh, I feel so terrible. I tried to look for weeks and I've observed nothing. The king must have given up on me. So you see the kind of hermeneutical part of it, that the interpretation, you have to come up with something that is meaningful and not just a correct observation or calculation. And that there is this hermeneutical, the interpretation part, that sometimes puts astrologers in very precarious positions. And that's true for an astrologer in the 21st century, just as for an astrologer at the Babylonian court, where they had, or in the Roman Empire, where they were very strong but also quite vulnerable. And that's an interesting combination of what is actually going on there in this discipline. And if you go through the centuries, you see this as a red thread of astrological history, that there's this conversation between empirical research and testing and what we today would call scientific method, and the hermeneutical part of it. And another example would be the horoscope selections, collections in the early modern period. Mm-hmm. And Günther Oesmann did a lot of research on that, and others as well. Another forgotten kind of historical source that we have, that these people in the 16th, 17th and century were collecting, and Kepler was one of them, of course, but they collected charts also to test the ancient theories. And like Ptolemy, who said that I couldn't come up with all, in the 2nd century, I couldn't have come up with all my theories without having the astronomical diaries in the archive in Alexandria or wherever he had access to it. So that was an empirical basis on it. And then you have this ancient system of knowledge and method to interpret a chart and so on, to do your spiel. But then these methods were also developed further in the Islamic context in the Middle Ages, and then later as well, with new algorithms, with new kinds of interpretations and rules and house system, whatever, you name it, it's everything. And so many people as practitioners in the early modern period were dissatisfied with Ptolemy's rules and with all these things. We need more in the house description or whatever. So let's collect these charts and do a kind of survey. So it's not just a curiosity, it's also a what we today would call a true empirical scientific approach to chart reading that motivated these people to compare charts and to test hypotheses. If Jupiter is in this, and if this means something, then it should also mean the same thing in other charts. So this kind of empirical research was a very strong element of it. And then at the same time, like Cardano, who said, well, the art cannot be taught in total because we can only teach the judgment of the expert. And that, so there is this hermeneutical part of it again that's still today. I mean, it's so complex if you read a chart that you have to make selections and you have to focus. Some is based on experience, others is selections based on intuition or the feedback that you seem to get from your client. All these things are part of the hybridity of this knowledge system, which is fascinating.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was listening to you, and I was recalling some of my authors, which these are religious people, so they are trying to do a practice of astrology that is fitting to a religious context. So it has to be naturally explained. So it's that typical restructuring of astrology of the 17th century. And at the same time, you can see them struggling with several facets of the astrology which cannot be explained. But they need them, for example, for medicine. Yes, for example, for medicine, they need it for medicine, but that doesn't fit with what they were saying before. For example, one that I find very curious is that they removed the house meanings as being superstitious and making no sense. So the houses are basically a method to measure the intensity of the planet's strength. So there is no meaning. But then they come to medicine, and they need the sixth house to signify sicknesses and the eighth house to signify death, and that doesn't match. And you can see them struggling to achieve an explanation, and it's very interesting because you can see the fight between these two processes going in, and the symbolic aspect is necessary, and they cannot get rid of it, or else the system just goes down.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, they are struggling, and you also see. I mean, medicine is also so interesting to look at, because there you also can see these two ways that of approaching illness or whatever, or healing, and the body and its connection to time and so on, and processes. And you can see, for instance, in Paracelsus also, you can see the polemic that is going on in the scientific understanding of medicine. Like there was this new empirical approach coming up in his period, 16th century, and then you have to repeat our observations in nature. That was a new kind of claim, and we still believe in this. Yeah? And I mean, if you look into contemporary science, how often it is actually repeated is a different question. Yeah? Also in science, and we can think of Bruno Latour and all these critics who say that science is not an exact endeavor, it's a social endeavor. And I mean, that is still the case. But if you look into the 16th century, and you see then this battle about methods to study nature and the body and illnesses and medication and all these. And then you have Paracelsus, who's always fun to read, but very, very polemic. And then he has this polemic about these idiots who think that you can have an experiment and a week later you can do the same experiment. How stupid are you not taking into account that of course you cannot repeat it because the stars are different?
Yes.
It's never the same experiment. How naive are these people? And you can then see these different kind of paradigms clashing in such an interesting way. And we today think, okay, well, we made a decision and we chose the successful system. I mean, you can also trouble this narrative that we have in many interesting ways.
That's so interesting. I have a question about this because you have been talking about astrology since antiquity. And one thing I think we all agree is that astrology is a survivor of everything because it survives all kinds of crises. It still remains. And I wonder, and this is my question, is this hybrid nature of astrology, could it be at the same time a strength and its weakness? Because the hybridity of astrology is probably one of the things that allows it to survive, but at the same time it puts astrology in this kind of between
No
two
man's
worlds,
land.
no man's land.
Yeah.
So how can we um, look at this hybrid nature regarding its survival? I don't know if astrology today is not exactly the same as in antiquity, obviously, but that is because it survived. At the same time, it changed and remained. So it's so interesting to see this. I don't know exactly how to formulate this question, but just a few ideas for
I
you.
think it's a very good way to put it. That it is both a one aspect why it survived in some form, in different forms, of course. But we're still talking about astrology, and even if you look into the contemporary, the 21st centuries, it's even booming in the Western world. So there's certainly an aspect of this flexibility, the hybridity, which I don't mean as a negative thing, but a kind of, or polyvalence, if you want to use. But it is a different. It can look differently from different perspectives. That's certainly a good thing if it wants to survive. And at the same time, you like what you said already. It's also it opens up critique from different points of view, actually, but particularly also from the contemporary science approach and the methods that we have, that basically marginalize all philosophical or spiritual aspects or links between different levels of the cosmos or whatever. So what we see is a kind of distinguishing of domains where astrology might be useful and astronomy might be more useful, and these don't talk to each other in the way they talk to each other in earlier periods. So I agree, and then you also see this particularly coming from the more intellectual astrologers, if you want. Also in the 20th century, you have examples of that, like Thomas Ring in Germany, for instance, one of the major, maybe the most important astrologer in the 20th century in German-speaking context, where they tried to come up with a new understanding of astrology that is more in sync with social scientific approaches and also with natural science approaches. So there are attempts at coming to kind of symbiosis, or to bring them together. Carl Gustav Jung would be another example, and many people in his generation, particularly before the Second World War or in the interbellum phase, where there were so many ideas about the link between astrological approaches or astrological tradition and the new physics, and the new science that is holistic and not reductionist. And you have these with in the quantum physics, in theory of relativity. So in the 2020s, you have a lot of interesting conversation that also included astrology, like Wolfgang Pauli, a Nobel laureate in physics, who even wrote a book together with Carl Gustav Jung on synchronicity. And so there was this conversation that was basically lost, I think, after the Second World War, where we had a very strong reductionist, very strong empiricist understanding, very anti-philosophical in science, particularly in the US. In Europe, there wasn't much going on anyway, certainly not in Germany. So a lot of traditions were also broken in that. And then you that's the thesis of Kaiser, how the hippies saved science. You know? So then you had this kind of revival in the transpersonal movement in the 60s and 70s. Also what then later was called New Age movement, but this is a very problematic distinction. It's a revival of philosophy of nature approaches in quantum physics that led to quantum mysticism and all these spiritual kind of things that also brought forth astrologers like Richard Tarnas, whom I mentioned earlier, and his understanding of putting this all together. But it certainly comes more from the practitioner side than, or from the astrologer's side than from the scientific side. But when it comes to more general philosophical understandings of what does it mean to bring metaphysics or spirituality together with physics, and also biology is a big thing now to look into consciousness, in planetary consciousness that is different than what we can measure, and all these conversations that are going on. Maybe it will also include astrology at some point again. I don't know.
Mm-hmm, yeah. I hope so. And also you mentioned tradition, and there is, in the middle of this new movement, there's also the so-called return to the tradition, which raises this interesting question that is, what is tradition? Where should we go to find the pure tradition? And I know you addressed this question several times. So I would like to have your thoughts on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, tradition is always something that we identify somehow as a red thread that leads to maybe to what we are or what we don't want to be anymore or whatever. So we tradition is always something that helps in terms of emplotment of narratives and so on. So we have this very strong narrative about how modern science came about. And that goes back to Thales in the Greek ancient world, 5th or 6th century BC, where for the first time metaphysical or religious interpretations of what's going on in nature are no longer accepted as an explanation. So he was modern avant la lettre, something, yeah, and all these narratives that we have, and we forget about that Thales thought that without the gods we wouldn't know anything. But I mean that doesn't match totally our kind of understanding of the rational Greeks. So tradition is always something that we make, but we don't make it up, right? So there's always something that we can refer to, or that we can be proud of, or that we want to have a critical look at it, or whatever. So we always engage this kind of tradition. But I think and when you look into concrete pockets of tradition or parts of this system that we call astrology, it is interesting that there is some amazing continuity. And if you look at certain interpretations of the planets. For instance, if you go back to Babylonian texts like 4,000 years ago, Omina texts or whatever, if they relate Venus to a certain impact, or Mars, or whatever terms they use then for these planets, and so there's a certain continuity, and at the same time the continuity is also quite simplified, right? So Venus is this, or there's a certain, is still, I mean, there are still astrologers today who use Ptolemy's interpretation of the houses or something, which has come under critique for many centuries. But there's still, you can identify certain lines that are running through, and that makes it quite fascinating, I think. And I don't know many other systems of knowledge where you can see this amount of continuity, certainly when it comes to the Euro-Mediterranean cultural sphere.
Okay.
Yes, that's what I think astrology provides in terms of the historical and cultural study. It's millennium old, so you can see these variances and these interactions and these changes with society, with culture, with scientific knowledge. So it's very rich, as you were saying, it's a very rich example, case study for this kind of shift, transformation, and interaction. Yeah.
We always say it's kind of very solid. It has a solid core and a very flexible external part, so it's very adaptable to different cultures, not only European, as you know, but different cultures, different religions, different society systems. And at the same time, there's this, what you just mentioned, this continuity, this coherence in the basic principles. So the basic ideas are there, and then they are like getting this cultural makeup for different cultures. So this is one of the interesting parts, probably one of the elements that secures its survival. Simple principles, and then adaptability, so to say. So it's a very fascinating topic. That's why we are talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it's I mean, there are other, if you, maybe it's a basic human desire to know about the greater meaning of my life, and also maybe the future, or the past. But the advantage of astrology is, if you compare it to other prognostic systems that were prominent in the ancient world, like sacrificial animals, all kinds of the flight of the swallows, whatever. I mean, all these things, and there were also complex systems of knowledge that were read then by experts. But even then, already in antiquity, astrology also works when the sky is overcast, because you can calculate where Mars is, and all these. So the kind of the rational, or the what we would call the scientific part of it, was also, through these centuries, I think a reason why it survived in this continuity.
Yes,
because it was open to kind of not only to interpretation, but also to demonstration.
So it is both scientific in the sense that it is open to demonstration, and also because it fulfills a basic human need, which is to understand. Yes, that's probably why it is so relevant still today.
Yes. Yeah. No.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Yeah.
Well, we could stay and talk until Christmas, because this is a very interesting topic. And thank you.
Yeah.
We want to thank you very much.
Yeah,
oh,
and
want to say
I want to ask you of your current projects a little bit.
Of course.
You are associated with that Counterpoint project. Could you please tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So there are two things. The one, both of my current activities relate to what we've talked about, because the Counterpoint navigating knowledge is a kind of network that we build up, a platform where we provide perspectives on different forms of or systems of knowledge. Also to start thinking about, or to continue thinking about, how do we get out of this planetary crisis that we are in, and are there traditions, like what you said about traditions, are the traditions that help us to get the bigger picture, or get different perspective of what is going on. And also, is there understandings of science that also are self-critical in a way, so that we reduce our understanding of the planet and what's going on the planet to 20th century science? Is that really helpful, or do we need to extend that to other perspectives as well? Can we learn from indigenous knowledge systems, from art, from literature, from knowledge systems like astrology that were discarded in mainly only in Europe and North America, not in India or in other parts of the world, but so can we come up with a kind of conversation of that? And so that is one activity I'm involved in, and the other one, more concrete, is the book project that I've just finished. So the German version came out last year already, and I'm now having the English version copy edited, and it will come out with Columbia University Press in spring. And the topic is also resonant with what we talked about. It is a cultural history of the soul in the 20th century. And that also addresses astrology, but also this interesting phenomenon that you see that until the 1920s in European discourse, the soul was everywhere. Everyone talked about the soul and consciousness and spiritual links to whatever, holistic understandings of science and philosophy and all these in different disciplines, approaches to the concept. And then after the Second World War, you see that psychology got totally rid of the soul. There's not a concept that is used anymore. Even in psychological dictionaries, if you look them up, there's not even an entry on the soul anymore. So the discipline of psychology was so focusing on being an empirical science, very reductionistic and behavioristic. So there's no room for kind of spiritual vague concepts or something. But at the same time, the soul was extremely popular outside of the academic discourse. And the popular culture is all over the soul. So the whole transpersonal movement is about the soul. And what you see is that the soul is turned into consciousness in the English-speaking world, and higher consciousness, the anima mundi, the world soul that Carl Gustav Jung wrote about, and Wolfgang Pauli as a physicist wrote about, who already said in the 30s that since Kepler, the anima mundi was lost, and we have to regain it. That was a Nobel laureate in the 1930s, right? But it was completely lost. But in this kind of new cultural context that we sometimes call New Age, but it's much broader. It's broad transformation of American and European discourses that happen in the second part of the 20th century, where these conversations were put together again, and the anima mundi, the world soul, became world consciousness or cosmic consciousness in all these movements, and it's a very popular term, and so I trace basically or reconstruct the discourses on the soul. It's not a history of psychology or whatever, or the soul. I don't even know what the soul is, and I'm not interested in knowing what the soul is, but it's so interesting to look at what people think about the soul. So these discourses on the soul, the animistic new religions and spiritualities that have come up in this, and they are all over the place in the 21st century. Animism is no longer a boo word. So it's a very positive self-identifier in environmentalist approaches, in nature-based spiritualities, in all kinds of contexts, including astrology. I think that's also one reason why we see a rise of astrological practice again in the 21st century, because it also has to do with a kind of understanding of the soul, or the link between the individual soul and the cosmic things in some way or another. So in some way, this is also related to astrology. And I'm now working on that publication, which will also keep me busy next year, I guess.
I'm looking forward to
looking
it.
Forward to
it will be in 2021.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we are looking forward to it.
The English version is done. Basically, only has to be copy edited, and then it will come out with Columbia.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great! Wow. We're looking forward.
Okay, we're all looking like this.
Well, I would thank you very much for that. It was a
great conversation.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
And when the book is ready, maybe we can have another podcast specifically about this
book. Yes, and,
sure.
Other topics.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.